Let's take a look at your market news now. Shares across Asia tracking a slump in global markets. Investors took profits following recent rallies and awaited a deluge of company and economic announcements. Higher U.S. bond yields also weighed on sentiment, while investors were cautious ahead of a U.S. Federal Reserve meeting today. Tokyo stocks fell for the fifth straight day. A strong yen also affected the shares of exporters. The Nikkei lost 1.4%. Hong Kong and Shanghai stocks are closed lower. The Hang Seng Index lost 1.0%, and the Shanghai Composite Index dropped by 0.9%. Wall Street pulled back from record highs yesterday, with the S&P 500 marking its biggest one-day percentage decline in about 5 months. The index was weighed down by a slide in Apple shares. The Dow Jones Industrial Average fell by 0.6%. The S&P 500 lost 0.6% as well, and the Nasdaq Composite Index dropped by 0.5%. Let's take a look at markets closer to home now. We go to the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. Nompumelelo Sizeba is standing by. Good afternoon, Nompumelelo. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Nzinga. Well, the global markets have generally been selling off today, and the all-share index has had a really torrid time of it, with mining counters and financials very heavily hit. Viceroy Research, this is a company that researches into various companies, and it also highlighted the problems at Steinhoff. It came out with a report today on Capitec. And as a result, it was a very damning report talking about how the company refinances bad debts and doesn't declare those bad debts. As a result, the share was sold off to the tune of about 25%. Those losses have since receded, but it's caused massive damage. But interestingly enough, though, the regulator of banks, that is the Reserve Bank, has come out to say, as far as we're concerned, Capitec is well capitalized. We don't have any problems with them because they do supervise banks on a regular basis. So that may have helped the share somewhat, but still it's put a bit of a stink on Capitec. Also we see that, well, basically it just means that Capitec is going to have to struggle to tell shareholders and potential investors that it does have a value proposition. This doesn't look good for it at the moment. Let's take a look at the indicators. Well, I'm joined by Chris Gilmore, independent analyst, to break down everything that's happening today. Welcome, Chris.
Great to be here, Nompu.
Good stuff. Let's start with the global picture first. General sell-off going on in global equities. What's going on?
We're getting confusing reports from Donald Trump and his advisors. Last week in Davos, we saw Mr. Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, and Mr. Ross, the Commerce Secretary, both talking about a weaker dollar. And then Trump comes along and talks about a stronger dollar. So we're not entirely sure what's happening there. Excuse me, the dollar has gone a bit stronger, and then today it's a little bit weaker. So, we saw last night on the Dow and the S&P, markets going a bit weaker. We're still waiting to see, what's happening with companies in the US. With tax reforms coming through, should be good for them. But generally speaking, we've had a bit of a sell-off in the wake of a really good run in the US. I think this is a natural pullback. And of course, on the JSE, we've and we'll come on to that in a moment, because of the volatility that we've had injected today because of Capitec, we're down about 2.5%. But generally speaking, I think we're looking at a situation that we should reasonably have expected a bit of a retracement, given the euphoria we've had in the past few days and weeks.
Now, we see that the rand has been rather volatile in the past day or so. It weakened to 12 against the US dollar, having appreciated to close to 11.80 earlier. But now it's gone back down to 11.91. So I wonder what's going on. But my principal question really is that as the rand generally firms, What does this mean for exporting companies and for the trade picture going forward if this is indeed sustained?
Okay. First of all, we've got to bear in mind that if you go back about a year, just prior to the cabinet reshuffle and getting rid of Praveen Gordhan, the rand was one of the best performing currencies. And then because of politics locally, it slumped and it's come back again. It's got pretty much back to where it was in March last year. But to your point about exporters, I think we have to be careful here. A weak rand, yes, on an intermittent basis and on a very temporary basis can be a good thing. But at the end of the day, ultimately, exporters have to be able to stand on their own 2 feet. They have to be able to produce goods at globally competitive prices. And, you know, when you take the rand into consideration, when it goes a little bit higher, obviously it works against them. If it goes a little bit lower, it helps them a bit. But ultimately, they must be able, as I say, to produce on a globally competitive basis. Otherwise, in the longer term, they'll not be able to compete at all.
Indeed. Now, let's get straight into Capitec, which I think the viewers are quite interested in. Many people holding that stock, I'm sure. It's been a darling. Like Steinhoff, it was a darling. And Viceroy Research have come out with this very damning report questioning their model, their financing model, suggesting that the Reserve Bank should come in and bring in a curator to actually take care of that particular company. Massive value destruction that's been caused, 25% down at some point in the session. What are your thoughts on this whole thing?
Number of things, Nampu. First of all, if you look at this report, and I haven't looked at it in its entirety, I've just looked at the first few pages, it doesn't seem to be nearly as weighty and as meaty as the Steinhoff report, okay? And I think that's important. There's a lot of assumptions here. We believe that this points to, it's a bit more nebulous. In fact, it's a lot more nebulous than Steinhoff. Secondly, they've taken on a bank. But when you take on a bank in South Africa, you also take on the South African Reserve Bank. And I don't know if they know what they're biting off with this one. And there's, as you said earlier, the Reserve Bank has jumped in here and said, as far as they're concerned, it's well capitalized. I'm not entirely sure if the viewers are aware that because the banking system is so highly regulated in South Africa, the Reserve Bank is in there all the time, looking at any possible loopholes. And I think if the kind of things that Viceroy is talking about really existed, then I'm sure the Reserve Bank would have picked this up. Look, I'm not saying there's not the possibility of something going on, but I'd be very surprised.
Very quickly, you also mentioned that PSG, which has quite a large stake in Capitec, has also suffered as a result, and it suffered due to Steinhoff, which it also had a big stake in.
Yeah, it's been a bad few weeks for the Stellenbosch Mafia, hasn't it? That's right, 30% stake in Capitec. So it's down, last I saw it was down about 20% as well. And this is one of the big drivers for PSG. PSG is a good solid company, but I think the cream on top has always been Capitec. So again, taking pain because of this, unfortunately.
Indeed. Well, we've run out of time. We'll leave it there. Thank you for your insights as always. Well, let's just watch this space on Capitec. I'm sure the saga will continue.